Everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. Very pleased to have with me Peter Lanes and Max and Julie Thompson. Tonight we're going to look at worlds in collision and the road that leads to nowhere. And what's going on here is that it's a very brief introduction to Emmanuel Velikovsky, who basically is a 20th century figure, and Samuel Butler, who lives between both the 19th and a little bit into the 20th century. And both of them are highly controversial figures. Now, I want to start with Immanuel Velikovsky, who was a Russian Jew, came from a well-off family and received very high levels of education. And by the 1920s had qualified in medicine and was practicing as a psychiatrist, and well and truly au fait with the works of Sigmund Freud. But he also had a lot of interest in what we might call hardcore science, and he was one of the key figures that set up the University of Jerusalem. And Velikovsky is a very influential figure in some ways, and is almost a hated figure in other ways. And what happened was that he wrote a book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision. And in essence, Worlds in Collision is about the catastrophes that occur to planet Earth. We're used to thinking in terms of climate change as being the chief catastrophe. But Velikovsky belonged to that school of biologists who believed that there were massive interventions that forced evolution along its inevitable path. Things like comets hitting the Earth and so on and so forth. And he had a series of catastrophic interventions that in essence he derived, I think, from his Jewish understanding of the reading of the creation stories. Now, to show what his main idea was in terms of geological catastrophe, just think of the beautiful planets. We're used to the images that come from NASA, and here's the solar system, beginning with Mercury and going all the way out to Pluto. I don't know what the current state of the debate on whether Pluto is still regarded as a planet or not a planet, but anyway, that's the solar system as Velikovsky understood it. And what he proposed was really extremely interesting. He believed that Venus was originally a moon of Jupiter. So there's Jupiter, the gaseous giant in the middle, what we call Venus orbiting round. And he said, okay, something occurred around about 3,500 BC, and Venus flew out of its orbit, and that caused geological catastrophe back on Earth. Catastrophic planetary intervention caused massive cultural changes on planet Earth. And he proposed this book, this thesis, in the 1950s, and there was an immediate kind of outcry about the publication of the book. And the reason was that he proposed that Macmillan, who were a highly respected academic press, publish the work, and various people had got wind of Velikovsky's ideas, and they objected so strongly that Macmillan actually withdrew publication of the book, which had already sort of escaped out as a kind of a popular science book. And they moved it over, I can't remember, may have gone to Doubleday to do the publishing, in other words, to a non-academic press. And the American Association for the Advancement of Science and people like the astronomer Shapley and Carl Sagan, they conducted the equivalent of a trial that would have made, a heresy trial that would have made Galileo blanch. And so you've got this highly influential Jewish psychiatrist who extended the reach of his science into the fields of geology and astronomy, and came up, I think, with a not unreasonable reading of catastrophic events as being the main cause of evolutionary change on Earth, and sort of micromanage that into the biblical pattern of disasters. Well, the scientific establishment turned Velikovsky into the archetypal anti-science. Well, I suppose in popular opinion he was a kind of folk hero because his works took off, particularly the Reader's Digest, which was slanted towards a sort of a creationist stance, really went to town with Velikovsky, but lots of other popular science reviewers thought it was a great work. So there was this figure who became hated, in a sense, by the scientific establishment, and at the same time was instrumental in setting up the University of Jerusalem. And it would not be true to say that all the scientific establishment hated him. There's a long and voluminous correspondence, I think, with Einstein that was only published decades after Velikovsky died. So we've got Worlds in Collision. He also wrote another popular book that put him on the outer, and very much on the outer. And the scientific press would not give Velikovsky a forum during the rest of his life to further explain his ideas. It had to remain in the realm of popular, maybe not all that academic kind of science. So having said that, I'm just wondering, are there any comments that you would like to make at this point, any point of clarification about Velikovsky, Peter Lane, or anything come up on the chat pod?
I think it's interesting that Velikovsky's basic thesis has been picked up by a whole variety of science fiction writers.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I suspect that Velikovsky is so steeped in Jewish tradition that he needed to read out of the early biblical books, a kind of scientific understanding of what happened. And in that sense, I don't know that he's so different from Einstein, but Einstein's God wouldn't intervene, like in the book of Exodus or with any of the miracle stories. Whereas I have the feeling that Velikovsky's God, though it operates through catastrophe, there's still some kind of guiding hand there. But for Einstein, the idea of miraculous intervention, like you'd find in Exodus, is just not feasible. Max and Julie say they find it interesting how popular thinking can go at a tangent to science. Well, science, as far as I can see, is basically popular thinking amongst a certain group of people. And scientific revolutions happen when all of a sudden the popular model collapses. The great example is, of course, whether the Earth is at the center of everything or whether the sun is at the center. And it was popular science, well established, and with the theory of epicycles, they really did have that down to a very fine art. And so the popular scientific view actually had to give rise to something that was very unpopular. So excellent question, Max. Okay, let's move on and have a look at a century back with Samuel Butler. And Samuel Butler came to New Zealand in the 1850s, and his life in the Upper Rangitata for 4 years gave rise to a series of 4 books: Life and Habit, Evolution Old and New, God the Known and God the Unknown, Unconscious Memory, Luck or Cunning. That's 5 books actually. And these books, absolute examples of a blending of science, theology, an attempt to unpack biblical meanings. It's a kind of Velikovsky a century before. And in the same way, Butler suffered the same fate as Velikovsky. And when I was doing research for my doctorate, I stumbled onto an example. Really, Butler came here in 1859 to make his fortune. And I stumbled on this example from the Christchurch Press, that this little series of articles about Samuel Butler writing about the reception of Charles Darwin's Evolution of Species in the province of Canterbury. And here we are in the upper reaches of the Rangitata, which is as far away from Darwin in England as you can possibly imagine. And Butler does the sort of Velikovsky thing. He tries to unpack Darwin and rewrite science. Just by way of background, Butler left England because he failed to please his father, who was a Church of England clergyman, and he wanted his son Samuel to also be a clergyman, but he failed because he started to have doubts about whether infant baptism was true, whether it was efficacious. And eventually, because Samuel Butler hankered to be an artist and his father couldn't really stand that, his father basically gave him an allowance and sent him out into the colonies so that he wouldn't have to put up with him. Well, out there in the upper Rangitata, Butler started to study in a very deep kind of way what Darwin was on about. And though it was a really difficult life up there, he had some help from a shepherd. He bought some books in for his spiritual sustenance, if you like, his intellectual sustenance. He even had a little harmonium brought in so he could play music. He was not a gifted composer, but he was a composer of sorts. He just had the artist's eye for everything. He is a very skilled photographer. And in fact, some of Butler's photographs, when he eventually went back to England, having made his fame and fortune here, he went on tours of Italy, and some of his photographs are absolutely superb. He had some of his paintings hanging in the Royal Academy. So though his father had hated the idea of him being an artist, Butler actually succeeded in that. He also succeeded in being a successful sheep farmer in the upper Rangitata, which must have been an extremely difficult environment in which to operate. Butler's great thesis, if you like, is, it's not in that title, What is Revelation? This is a kind of where he eventually gets to over the next 30 years of writing. But he believes that essentially Darwin's theory of natural selection was not the chief mechanism of evolution. The French scientist Lamarck had a better explanation. And Butler also argued very strongly that Charles Darwin had stolen the evolutionary concepts from his grandfather Erasmus. And he wrote about this in all of these books, in a series of papers. And once again, the scientific establishment rapidly turned against this young upstart who had made his fortune in New Zealand. How could he possibly foot it, if you like, with Darwin? And the accusations that Butler levelled at Darwin having stolen the ideas, etc., really rankled with Darwin's supporters. And Butler found himself on the outside of the scientific establishment, just like Velikovsky. So essentially they were both subjected to trial, in inverted commas, by their peers. Their peers didn't want to admit that these unorthodox opinions might contain some elements of truth. And both rejected the strict fundamentalist Judeo-Christian truth claims, but both of them remained enmeshed in the myths and legends, the biblical images, the biblical facts and history, etc. They couldn't leave it behind. Velikovsky couldn't leave behind Exodus, and once we were slaves, but now we are free, and that led to the establishment of the University of Jerusalem. And Butler could not leave behind he not the efficacy of infant baptism, but the question of, is there a God? And if there is a God, how is this God revealed? And Butler argued in such a way that it in some ways laid the framework in Whitehead's evolutionary idea of God. And the revelation that we're talking about here is that it comes through the observation of nature. Whatever we understand by the term God and how God acts, whether we believe that there's catastrophe that causes evolutionary change, whether we believe in Lamarckian evolution or natural selection, or we know that the scientific world has moved on because it now is really enmeshed in questions about genetics. But all of these things continue to reveal something underlying the world of nature. And that last photograph, we're just looking back towards Mesopotamia, and Butler's Erewhon is on this side of the Rangitata River, and Erewhon is almost nowhere spelt backwards, not quite. So here's the great truth, I think, that both of these scientific renegades proclaimed. I believe they're both saying that somehow the universe and the natural processes of the universe affect the human mind. And equally, particularly for Butler, the human mind affects the way the universe is. It's not dissimilar to Shakespeare, you know, all the world's a stage. The stage of the universe, the only stage that we can know about, is the human mind. The human mind is revelation. The universe is revelation. And evolution is simply seeing the revelation through the lens of the time we create for ourselves. Okay, Max and Julie are saying human perception obviously influences how we see the universe, but does it really influence the absolute state of the universe other than causing mankind to do things to make change? Max, that's a very erudite question. And I think it takes us deep into the science of quantum physics. And in some ways, Butler, I wouldn't want to say that he anticipated the results of quantum physics, not at all, but he anticipated that human will and intention can change things quite profoundly. Your question is, does perception really influence the absolute state of the universe? Now, the quantum physicists, if I've understood them correctly, would say, yes, absolutely. The observer always affects the outcome of the experiment. And this is, I really thank you for the question. This is what Niels Bohr was on about when he said that the way in which quantum physics has to be understood is that our volition has an effect. I don't know whether he said we've moved mankind back to the centre of the universe. I suspect that was a line of a play about Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. But if he didn't say it, he would have certainly meant it, that somehow or other our direct observation of the universe changes the way the universe is. This comes up not just in quantum physics, but started to emerge in the science of epigenetics, which I think is the next phase after genetics. And the epigeneticists would say genes have a profound influence, obviously. Environment has a profound influence, obviously. But volition also, that is human intention, human will, also has a profound influence on our own bodies. I think we've probably come to the end of our recording, and I just really want to thank Max and Julie for coming in and helping me just to go through this, and it will appear inside the Genesis and Science group. So thank you very much indeed for watching,